So, greetings again. This is turning out to be somewhat occasional video blog, but anyway, I've got a little time and space, so I'm checking in again and sharing some of my musings with you. So yeah, a couple of things I've been thinking about that I thought I'd share with you. Firstly, just to locate myself, I'm in Tasmania, Hobart, place I grew up, and where my wife and I have moved to at this point in time. So it's winter, coming into winter, it's sunny and cold out. And I'm overlooking the Derwent River. It's very beautiful outside, fresh air, so that's good. Yeah, so Gestalt, living Gestalt, what else can I share with you? Well, something that I can't recall whether I've mentioned it, but Satara, my wife, and I have developed a concept called the unvirtues. And the notion is basically that it's sort of like the shadow, but we talk about it in a particular kind of a way. So, you know, most of us want to strive to be virtuous in some way, however we define virtue. In some sense, being a better person, or being more caring, or developing certain qualities that we'd like to improve at. So I mean, you know, that's part of the aspiration of human growth, and that's natural and normal and probably healthy, as long as it doesn't become like an extreme thing or perfectionism or a rod that you beat yourself on the back with. The trouble, though, is that pretty well anything that I aspire to can tend to mean that I'm focusing in that direction and not really paying attention to the other side of it. So, for instance, take an example. You know, a virtue that I can say, well, I've got is persistence. I'm very persistent. In fact, I'm so persistent that sometimes it's a bit ridiculous. Now, that's very helpful when I want to achieve a goal and not give up. And, you know, you can see that as a positive thing, and it's certainly something that's true of me. So to recognize the unvirtue, though, is to look at what's positive and look at the negative side of it, which sounds, you know, negative. It's not like positive psychology, or it's not like affirmations. And yet, from a Gestalt point of view at least, it's good to recognize and own who I am in all the capacities. So yes, I'm persistent, and yes, that's a real strength. And what's the other side of persistence? Well, the unvirtues is like an invitation to own, like, the self-interest. That's one way to think about it. So in my persistence, what's the self-interest? Well, certainly I'm going after what I want, and that's clearly about me. And the thing is, in my persistence, sometimes in pursuing what I want and persisting, I kind of override other people or override their no, because that's what persistence is keeping on going despite all the obstacles. So yeah, sometimes that's a great thing. And at the same time, sometimes that can lead to me sort of in a way disrespecting people's no, which is probably not generally a good thing. Now, of course, I do that in clever, subtle ways by getting around it or arguing with them or making other points. And it's certainly very useful in terms of bureaucracy. But when it comes to individuals, yeah, sometimes my persistence comes across as pushy and it turns people off. So to own the unvirtue would be to say, I'm persistent, and at the same time within that persistence, sometimes I disregard other people's boundaries, or I don't really care about their boundaries. I just want what I want. So now the persistence starts to sound less shiny and more like there's problematic aspects to do with it. But, you know, it's not about just dumping on myself and going, oh yeah, I'm a pushy person and I'm antisocial and that's terrible, and beating myself up. That's not what the idea is. The idea is to own this in a way which is neither proud nor overly sort of self-effacing. It's just like, yeah, I'm persistent, yeah. I'm good at stepping over people's boundaries, and I'm laughing, but it's not so funny. that can be useful sometimes, and sometimes that I can be insensitive in doing that. So I'm owning the insensitivity, my insensitivity within my persistence. So that's kind of one example of the unvirtues, and I guess over time I'll talk with you more about that, because I think it's a useful concept. And the thing is, what's really useful is to not just recognize that for my own development or something, also is the capacity to bring that into relationship, to acknowledge, yeah, this is a part of me, yes, I do this. And particularly if something occurs or somebody points it out, then that's really where it's a great opportunity to own the unvirtues within whatever my good intentions are, because generally I, and most people, will own the good intentions. Oh, but that's not what I meant. I just wanted to I just wanted to make sure that I still had the opportunity to get into the booking. You know, there's always a reason for doing what I do, and mostly I'm going to identify with a good intention. I don't want to identify with the more self-interested part. So where someone confronts me on that, then that's an ideal opportunity. So I did have a bit of an example of that the other day with my organizer in China, who is a very astute woman, and she gave me some feedback about my style, my over-helpful style. That's another one of my virtues, is being very helpful and liking to support people. And then within that, there's all sorts of threads of self-interest and places where that can go wrong. I can be too helpful and again come across as pushy, and that's what happened with her. So see, the thing is, I mean, Gestalt is like knowing who I am. So part of who I am is, yeah, I push at boundaries, and sometimes I push too hard with the best of intentions. And that happened in her case, where I was being helpful, but the way that I was being helpful to her, she was too much. It wasn't really helpful, and I was trying to be helpful in the organizing process by introducing her to people. And in China, sometimes people like to give a lot of advice. That's a mode of connection and communication, and sometimes that's a lot. You have to draw limits. I have to draw limits with people trying to move into the advice mode in the group or something. And so she found that some of the people that was being helpful to her and introducing to her were just wanting to give her lots of advice, and she really didn't need that kind of support. So she kind of confronted me with that, and because I'm kind of comfortable in knowing myself, I'm like, yeah, you're right. That's my helpfulness, my pushiness, and that's my going over the top, and also that's about my not really tuning into who you are. I kind of need you to spell out your boundaries clearly. Don't pick them up well. So the ability to acknowledge this, and in not almost, I'd say, a light-hearted way, or yeah, look, yeah, that's me, aren't I a bit much or something? That's a capacity comedians have, of course, to laugh at themselves, and it's a great thing to be able to develop. But to do that, I have to feel like full ownership, not just, oh yeah, that's a terrible part of me, I'm such a bad person. That's not really ownership, and that's not really bringing to relationship in a way which the other person's going to feel okay about. If I beat myself up, then they're going to feel bad as well. It's like they can't really tell me something without me going, mea culpa. So that's not what we're talking about. It's more just this, yeah, that's me too, and that's me, and that's me, and that's me. Owning all these different elements of me is very useful in all sorts of relationship, and certainly in interpersonal relationships. Some of the problems I've run into in my marriage are because I'm being defensive. And although maybe a situation where I feel like I'm being attacked or criticized, the more that I can own the grain of truth or recognize my self-interest rather than just my good intention, then that's likely to diffuse whatever the particular conflict is that's brewing. So it's a great skill. I don't know if you call it skill, ability, capacity to do this. And it does involve non-defensively being willing to look at these parts of myself and kind of proactively own the unvirtuous elements of who I am and my style and my personality and my behavior. So that's one thing I thought I'd talk to you a bit about. And the other thing is something that's really been on my mind is, because I'm a therapist, I'm in the helping professions, I like to help people. well, in a Gestalt way, being existentially with them, forming relational connection. But I don't know, both in therapy, there's limits, there's how much the client is, they want growth or they want change in their life, and how much are they really willing to do it, how much are they willing and able to do something different. I can do my best to support them in finding graded and personally appropriate ways that they can try out new ways of being. However, there's some basic position which is certainly, I think, what the existential approach to therapy does address, which is the question of choicefulness, like Sartre's idea that we're condemned to freedom, that we always have choice and we don't have a choice not to exercise choice no matter how constrained the circumstances. That leads to an awareness of, and hopefully the embracing of, responsibility for who I am and my life and the consequences intended and unintended of my actions, because ultimately it's me choosing to do what I do, me choosing to continue to be in the roles that I am. And the sense of being trapped is a sort of a disavowal in a way of my choicefulness. At any moment I can walk out of my life and walk into a different life if ultimately I choose that. But people feel entrapped and imprisoned in a whole variety of ways. So it's a big topic in Gestalt, and it's potentially very liberating. So that basic sense of choicefulness, which Sartre calls good faith, as compared to bad faith, which is blaming it on someone else, it's difficult because you can't teach someone that. You can't demand it. And even pointing it out is not that useful. People often get defensive, feel like you're blaming them or not understanding them. So it's a very delicate art in psychotherapy to be able to support someone to move into recognizing their choicefulness, and usually it's not just a matter of pointing it out point blank. And I've also been musing on the limits of people's evolutionary process in terms of their willingness to take that kind of responsibility for who they are and their choices in life. And sometimes, certainly you can see it, say, especially in cases of addictions, where someone's just downward spiraling and somewhere, no matter how much they've got the victim litany, they're making a choice to go down that addiction gurgle hole, with usually terrible consequences to themselves and the people around them. And classically, the thing that most makes the difference is the so-called hitting bottom, which is not something you can engineer, you can predict even. It's something that happens in a moment. It's hard to even identify what are the circumstances which lead to that. It seems kind of random in a way. Someone can go to therapy or do all sorts of things, but that moment of hitting bottom, they just reach that moment. And in some sense, I think that's true of all of us, in the sense that what is it that leads us to that point of really taking responsibility for our lives, for choosing life, for choosing to move forward without hanging on to bitterness and resentments. It's a difficult thing to do, because the bitterness and resentments tend to have elements of bad faith, of blaming other people. So how do I turn myself around? What can I do with other people? Well, it's difficult because in a way, some people are just not ready, willing to do that, and so they're going to keep doing the stuck things and keep complaining about the stuck things and keep blaming other people and other circumstances for their being stuck. And after a while, it gets difficult to be around. I mean, if you've got a friend or someone that you're close to who's in that mode, it's kind of wearing, because they're always in the victim and there's always other people responsible, and simply pointing that out doesn't usually help much. What does? I don't have the answer. I'm raising this as an open question. I've got a friend or two I was thinking one particular friend who's really stuck and really unhappy and has been for many years, and yet they, my input, my helpful input, my advice, my support, my care, none of that really seems to make a difference. They're just, in a sense, choosing to remain stuck, and that's very painful to be around. And it's hard to position myself, especially outside the therapy, or in the therapy I got a little bit more power or leverage or something, but outside the therapy as a friend, I don't know, accept them as they are with all their stuckness, well, I can kind of do that, but then there's a lot of complaining goes on. So I think that's a really challenging thing in our everyday lives, how to deal with my own bad faith and how to deal with other people's bad faith. Frank Farrell is a provocative therapist. He confronted people directly. I mean, so did Fritz Perls, and he would just find humorous but very sharp ways to confront people with their avoidances. That's one way to do it, and maybe that's a good way. Often people will just clam up if you do that, but I guess if it's done really artfully, with enough humour and connection, then sometimes that works. The slap in the face, sometimes that's what a friend needs. This particular friend I'm thinking, did the slap in the face and they're just like, oh, you don't really care for me. So, open question, living Gestalt. It's all very well in the therapy context, but how do we dealing with my own bad fate, that's easier. I've got some choicefulness ultimately over that. Sometimes I stay stuck in my unhappiness with the situation and feeling hard done by or self-pity. But after a while, I do move on, because that's not a very pleasant place to remain. It's kind of disempowered, so I can move on to being with the situation as it is, accepting my choices and their consequences, and feeling the freedom to making some choices to find my own way through there. So I can do that for me. But with friends who are in that downward spiral, I mean, to some degree, not getting too involved. Certainly that's the case with addictions. It's important not to try to rescue them, not to get pulled down with them, to kind of witness, to be with them, but to also maintain some boundary and distance, because it's very easy to get sucked into that, or to feel manipulated within that position. So the Gestalt emphasis on boundaries is very useful in this kind of regard. Stay connected, but also stay clear on the boundaries, which is what Shash would call differentiation. Okay, so that's a bit of a download. Hopefully there's some useful things there for you to muse about. Talk to you again.